Last night, Abe was running the introduction ideas through me, and I said, dude, just set the bar really low. I can only go up from there, and you miserably failed that test, but hold on. Honest to goodness, I feel like I'm the one just honored to be in the presence of this group of people. I mean, I look around the room and I see heroes of mine, folks whose shoulders I stand on, whose footprints I walk behind. And literally, some of the folks that I wrote about in books became some of my closest friends in this movement. And these are some dark times, I think. You know, if we believe that on the darkest nights you see the brightest stars, this is a good time to be alive. It's a good time to shine. And I want to say, you know, I grew up in Tennessee, and we're fighting some of the same principalities and powers down there. I fell in love with Jesus in the Bible Belt, and that's where everything started for me. I meet folks all the time that say, my life was such a mess, and then I met Jesus. You know, they tell me their testimony that they went to jail and all these things they did, and then they met Jesus and everything came together. And I'm like, God bless you. For me, it's the exact opposite. Like, I was a really good kid and I met Jesus, and that's what messed me up. Like, I didn't go to jail before I was a Christian. I've gone to jail like 30 times since. You know, whenever I'm hanging out with Abe, it's the good trouble. You know, it's Jacques Ellul, the great French thinker, that said, I don't know where we get the notion that Christians are just meant to be good, law-abiding citizens. He said Christians at their best have been the troublemakers. They've been the creators of holy mischief, the people who refuse to accept the world as it is and dream of the world as it could be. The prophets are the ones who don't defend the status quo, but they try to change it. And I think that's part of why I'm grieved today, because many of my fellow Christians, I don't assume everyone in here is a Christian, you know. In fact, I see many people leaving the church because of the contradictions that they see in the church, and that began to be my story. You know, I grew up, fell in love with Jesus, and started going to church, and my mentor, Tony Campolo, he said, we sing the hymns like Just As I Am, and we go to the altar singing Just As I Am, and then we leave just as we were, and we keep living just like we always have. It doesn't always change us. And I began to see that in the church I heard a lot about being pro-life, but we had so narrowly defined what that meant to one issue of abortion that we actually became the obstacles of life on many other fronts. Right? That I began to see that we would be more accurate to say that we're pro-birth rather than pro-life, because once somebody's born, we often forget about them. You know, somebody said if the pro-lifers were left in charge, you might want to stay in the womb as long as possible, because as soon as you get out, you're in trouble. You know, I began to see that I'm still passionately pro-life, but not on one issue. I'm trying to be consistent on all of them. I want to be a champion for life. And so it hurt me that when I looked at some of our history, you know, Christians, white evangelical Christians in particular, the ones that led me to Jesus, have been the obstacles to the dignity, the liberation, the healing of so many of those wounds. Even in Tennessee, I went to a little high school where we had the Confederate flag on our lunchroom trays painted on our walls. Until last year, we had a statue of Nathan Bedford Forrest, the founder of the KKK, in the Capitol. Lord have mercy. So you're not alone, Oklahoma, right? We're fighting some of those same things. I started looking at the death penalty. And that's what struck me so deeply, right? That 90% of our executions are happening in the Bible Belt. The Bible Belt is the death belt. Without the support of Christians, the death penalty wouldn't stand a chance. It's linked to our history too, right? That those same states that have held on to the death penalty are the same states that held on to slavery the longest, where lynchings were happening 100 years ago, is where executions are happening right now. So these demons run deep, and boy, they are resilient. And And yet I see courage. Everywhere we look, there's that courage to interrupt injustice. And that's what started happening for me. As I moved up to Philly, I began to interact with some of those holy troublemakers. One of our first things we saw happen in Philly is the city of love, right? That's what our name means, Philadelphia. And yet Philadelphia began to pass laws that criminalized homelessness. Tennessee's passing the same laws. I hear some of those, there's champions of those laws here. Philly made laws that made it illegal to sleep in public. It's a felony now to sleep in public in Tennessee. Many of those laws are true in Philly. And so we decided we've got to challenge those laws. And so some of my first activism before the death penalty even was we went to downtown Philly and we said we got to stir some mischief up. And so we brought in pizzas, and it was illegal to eat in the public parks in Philadelphia. It was illegal to bring food and share it. And then we had communion, we shared pizzas, we were slept in the park, and we were arrested, about 30 of us. And we went to jail, and I'll never forget it, because we were in court. And I had a shirt on that said Jesus was homeless. And the judge was, "Come here. Jesus was homeless." "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, the scripture says foxes have holes, birds of the air, and that's what the Son of Man had no place to lay his head. Jesus was homeless." And the judge said, "You guys might stand a chance." We did, We decided, we had a lot of great lawyers that joined us, but we decided we want to be spoken for by one of our friends who's lived the struggle. And so our buddy Alfonso, who had been on the streets for a lot of years, he agreed to represent us. We go to court, and they were throwing the book at us. The prosecutors wanted us to go to jail and serve time. They wanted us to pay thousands of dollars worth of fines, this was a kicker, and have hours and hours of court-sanctioned community service. And so then we go to court, and Alfonso stands up, and Alfonso says, "Your Honor, I'm representing the group, about 35 of us," and he said, "I want to say that we believe these laws are evil and wrong." And he sat down. I rest my case. And the judge said, "Listen, what's in question isn't whether or not y'all broke the law. I can tell very well that you all broke the law. What's in question are the laws that we're passing in this city that discriminate against some of our most vulnerable people that the DA was not happy." And then he said, if it weren't for people who broke the bad laws, we wouldn't have the freedom that we have. That's what this country built up from the Boston Tea Party to the Civil Rights Movement, the Underground Railroad, right? And he said, "These guys are not criminals, they're freedom fighters. And I find them all not guilty on every charge." The judge said, "And how can I get one of those t-shirts?" I sent him one. And we prayed every time we got arrested, we had the same judge, but we didn't. What's not really easy. And some of those laws we're still fighting against 20 years later, right? And yet I believe in the hope of the movement. And Sister Helen, I've heard Sister Helen say, water doesn't boil all at once. It doesn't have one big bubble on top. It begins to steam, right? And then you begin to see these little bubbles. And before long, it starts to roll. And I think that's happening right now, don't you? I think there's something simmering. And I hope that we can channel this current anger and pain and grief that we feel into change. And it feels impossible, but one of my friends often says that faith is believing despite the evidence and watching the evidence change. What it looks like to be people who are prophetic and imagining a different world is we refuse to accept the things that as they are right now. We believe that things can be different. And with every social movement that has changed the world, before it happened, everybody said it's impossible. The ending of slavery, the fall of apartheid, and after that movement happened, everybody looked back and says it was inevitable, right? That it was bound to happen, and yet history is made. So I look at this room and I look at people who know that we can do better than killing to show that killing is wrong. One of my first experiences with the folks, visiting folks at Unit 2 in Tennessee, like that's our death row is in Riverbend, Unit 2. And I can remember I was going in to visit the guys, and beforehand I was speaking at a conference, and the governor was speaking, and at the time it was Governor Bill Haslam, and he was facing the decision of whether or not to execute people, and I bumped into him on the way out on purpose, and I said, listen, I'm praying for you, and I said, I'm praying that you would do what Jesus would have you do. And then I got to go, and I sat down with the guys, and I said to them, I'll never forget, I said, I just bumped into the governor. I'm not going to tell you what I said yet, but I want to know, what would you say if you had a chance to talk to the governor? And I'll never forget there was silence for just a second. And then Kevin Burns came to me, he looked up and he said, we would ask the governor to come pray with us and hear what Jesus has done in our lives. And everybody said amen. And they weren't kidding. In fact, that became our campaign in Tennessee. Over half of the men at Unit 2 have now asked Governor Lee to come visit them and hear the story of what Jesus has done in their lives, to pray with them, because we know it would be harder for him to kill them. That proximity, even as we were there today, like visiting James Coddington, Don took me to visit him this morning, and I'm thinking, like, what has changed me is staying near to those who are struggling. And that's what this group is. That's what we're going to be doing in Oklahoma, is turning up the volume, right? Of those who are hurting, of what's at stake, the names, the stories of the 25 folks that are facing execution right now. And those stories change people. I can remember, for me, one of the guys I got to know in Tennessee, before he was executed, Don Johnson, he was convicted of killing his wife, and he did it. He was very open about what had happened. He had a really, really difficult life, and he didn't use that as an excuse, but it just helped understand a little more where he was at. And his daughter became the spokesperson for his execution. She said, I want the freak to cry, talking about that. And then I can remember, as I visited him year after year, I began to see what the Spirit was doing in him. And eventually, I got to be with his daughter. And she said, the Spirit's been working on me too. And she said, I went to visit my dad for the first time in 30 years. And I went to tell him off. And be done with it. And she said, but when we met, something happened. And she said, I did tell him all. I poured out my heart. And he listened. He received it. And then she said, something in me began to heal. And I realized that my hatred for him was not hurting him. It was hurting me. And I forgave him not so he could sleep at night, but so I could sleep at night. And she, in fact, became one of the outspoken opponents of his execution. She also said, it's not done yet. That's why I don't want him to die. I want to see how the story ends. And she said, he's the one who holds the keys to my mother. I know what perfume she wore now. I know what music she listened to. And I think those stories, they change us, the courage that I see in this room, the courage that we heard today at the events, the courage of the Jones family, the courage of the exonerees, the witness to innocence, all of the groups that are coming together here, it is contagious, right? It rubs off. And I remember I was actually at an event in Minneapolis, and I was going to speak, and they said, listen, you got to meet this woman, Mary Johnson. They took me to meet her, and she told me her story. Her son was killed on the north side of Minneapolis, and she instinctively, as the tragedy unfolded, she wanted the person who killed her son to have the harshest punishment possible at first. And then she said, That was my only son. And over time, she's Pentecostal. You don't mess with the Pentecostals, right? She's a Pentecostal. She tells it just like God dropped it out of the sky. She said, I read this poem, and it was these two mothers in heaven, and they were talking to each other, and they both had blue tints to their halo, and it was to designate they had lost their child in this world. And she said the one mother realized that she's talking to Mary, the mother of Jesus, and she said, Mother Mary, and they embrace, and Mary says back to her, tell me your story. And she says, I'm the mother of Judas. And she said, when I read that poem, I knew that there's another mother in this story. And she found her, the mother of a young man, O'Shea, who killed her son. And she said, we started an organization together called Two Mothers, so that we can accompany the mothers who have lost their kids on the street and the fathers, and we can accompany those who lose their kids to the system, where they end up often facing death, and they do this healing work together. And she ended up, over the years, getting to know O'Shea, the young man who had killed her son. And it took years, right? Years. Courage. They're doing restorative justice work, and she said, eventually, because he was so young when the incident happened, he was released from prison. And she said, we became partners in the work, and they ended up being next door neighbors and doing this work of a company. Anytime there's an incident of violence in their city, they go and they meet with everyone that's impacted by it. Now look at that work, and it's holy work, right? It's the work that heals the wounds of violence. We went to Minneapolis with the Fords, like Abe said, we've been beating guns and garden tools, and so many of these issues are related, right? And we're beating on this gun, beating it into a garden tool. And I can remember the words of Walter Brueggemann in he wrote the book, The Prophetic Imagination, right? And he says, this is what prophets are. We misunderstand the prophets. We think the prophets were fortune tellers, that they're trying to predict the future. But the truth is that the prophets are not fortune tellers, they're truth tellers. And they're not just trying to predict the future, they're trying to change it by waking us up to the present and inviting us to imagine a different future. So this cross that I'm wearing is made out of the barrel of a gun. And every time we transform the metal of the gun into something else, we are pronouncing that all things can be made new. That it doesn't have to stay this way. That even someone who has done something terrible is more than the worst thing they've ever done. And God is transforming all things. So as I look at Oklahoma right now, it's sometimes hard to imagine what it could be. But that's why we need each other right now, right? We feed each other hope. We go, you're not alone in your dreams for what Oklahoma could be, what Tennessee could be. And I want to say that as I think of what it takes to change some of these laws that we've seen, one of the stories I can remember of Mother Teresa. She's one of the folks that, when I think of what it means to be consistently for life, she's one of the folks that has been kind of an example of that, a mentor. And she spoke, she was consistently against the death penalty. She cared deeply about militarism and war. And I can remember John Deere, who's a Catholic priest, and he knew Mother Teresa. He called her up before one of the executions, and he said, Mother Teresa, you need to call the governor. And she called the governor, and she told him to do what Jesus would have him do, right? And that governor stopped the execution. John said, next time Mother Teresa and I were together, she grabbed me by the arms and started swirling me around, and we were dancing, and she said, he's still alive! He's still alive! And she said, we've got to spend our entire life trying to interrupt death. Interrupt the things that are crushing people's lives. Julius Jones is still alive, but the struggle is not over. We're going to party And that's this subverting of death is what the holy work we get to do. I tell some of one of my neighbors, she said, if you ever feel like the darkness is overcoming the light, it's okay to have hard days. Right? She said, even Jesus said, my God, why have you forsaken me? So I want to remind us tonight that that's where we're at. If we're feeling the deep loneliness of, my God, why have you forsaken me? Even Jesus felt that. Right? I mean, that blows my mind. God felt the absence of God. But we also know that the story ends with the power of love triumphing over hatred, life triumphing over death. We see that a new world is possible. And so I want to invite us, this is what we're doing tonight, right? We are in a moment that demands courage. Because it doesn't take courage to say slavery is wrong a generation after we end it. It took courage to say slavery is wrong when a lot of people thought it was all right. And it takes courage right now to say we can do better than death. We can do better than killing and show that killing is wrong. So I know we're going to end the death penalty. But the real question is, what role will Christians play? Will we be on the side of death or the side of life? So I'm so honored to stand with all of you who are the champions of life, the great subverters of death. And I look forward to the day where we can dance and say, we ended this thing, where we can come to Oklahoma and say, death has lost its sting here. May it be so. It's a great honor to be at the 30th year banquet and to be with all of you. Thank you so much.